When making self-combusting incense like cones and joss sticks, one critical aspect is having thoroughly powdered ingredients. Now, you can find a lot of incense ingredients in powdered form, but that isn't always the best choice. More importantly, it isn't always an option. And sometimes you won't be able to find powdered forms, and other times you may want to use materials that you've either grown or wild harvested yourself. So fear not. In this video, we'll explore the entire process for making awesome powders for your incense and for anything else you want to use it for. And we're also going to look at a variety of tools that make the process easier. I'll even show you how you can use a hammer to help make incense. All that on this episode of Incense Magick. If you're making incense that will use an outside heat source like charcoal or an incense heater, then powdering ingredients isn't critical. I think it's fair to say that powdering ingredients almost always improves the commingling of the different scents and helps them blend into a single cohesive scent, but when you use an external heat source, powdering is generally optional. When it comes to self-combusting incense, like sticks and cones, powdering is a very important step to ensure reliable, even burning. If your different ingredients are inconsistently powdered, your incense may sputter, burn unevenly, and even pop, especially if you're using resins in your blend. Powdering incense ingredients can be quite a task, but with just a few key tools, you can produce high-quality, finely powdered ingredients. Before you attempt to powder any ingredient, make certain it's as dry as possible. Woody and herbaceous materials like leaves and stems should be completely dry. If you find any moisture in those types of materials, continue to dry them. Resins are a little different. It takes a long time to dry resins completely, so you may find resins still retain a bit of moisture even after years of drying. Now, there's a trick to powdering those kinds of wet resins that we'll talk about in a minute. But the bottom line is to have every ingredient as dry as you possibly can before you make any attempt to powder it. Now, there are a lot of different tools that you can use for powdering, ranging from small hand tools to large power tools. Probably the most basic tool for powdering is a sharp knife or a razor blade. I like to use a hobby knife, but even a box cutter can be used. It takes a lot of patience to create actual powder with a knife, but a good knife makes the process of powdering easier because you can take large, hard pieces of material like chunks of wood and transform them into finely chopped pieces that will be far easier to powder. And when you use power tools, large chunks of material can damage the blades and even the plastic containers. So start by chopping or shaving the material with a knife first, and that makes the other steps a lot easier. When you're working with rare or expensive materials, the entire process might be done with a knife to ensure the material is never heated, since that would cause a loss of precious essential oils, and also that none of it is lost at all. Now, a sharp pair of scissors can accomplish the same task most of the time. Another tool that you might not think of for using for incense making is a hammer. Now, a hammer is a great tool for breaking up large chunks of resin. If you buy or collect resins in large quantities, you may have chunks that weigh a pound or more. A hammer can quickly transform those chunks into pieces that are small enough to powder. I mentioned earlier that there's a trick to powdering resins that are still moist. It's really a good technique to use almost any time you work with resins because it'll reduce the heating of the resin during the powdering process. And soft resins will smoke more than thoroughly dry ones, but you can still powder those soft ones by freezing them before you begin the powdering process. Freeze your resins overnight in a plastic bag. Once frozen, you can put that bag inside of a sturdier bag, like a thick paper bag or even a cloth bag, or several thin ones, and then put it on a hard surface like a cement sidewalk and pound it with the hammer. This approach might tear up the bag, so watch that you don't make a hole all the way through to the resin, or you might lose some of that precious material. But this is a great way to get resins to a very manageable size for further powdering. It's also a great way to work out your stress. Now, to create a true powder, you need something a little more sophisticated than a hammer. The first tool that many people reach for is the mortar and pestle. Now, these can be found in a wide variety of shapes and made from a lot of different materials. The mortar and pestle is the best for working with very small amounts of material. This tool is a good choice for powdering resins because it generates very little heat. It can be used to pound ingredients like a small hammer or to grind like a mill. Most resins are relatively soft and easy to powder, so they're the primary ingredients I powder with the mortar and pestle. When dealing with woody or leafy materials, this isn't always the best tool. Tough plant materials like sandalwood or sage leaf are not well suited for this tool, but if you have the patience and the upper body strength, you can powder most ingredients with a mortar and pestle. Probably the most useful of all the grinding tools that I use are small coffee or spice grinders. Although these are often labeled as grinders or mills, a true mill uses a pair of stones or metal plates pressing against each other to create the powder. Now that approach generates a lot of heat and definitely isn't appropriate for resins. That being said, most of these coffee grinders actually use spinning blades, not grinding plates. They're really more like a miniature blender, and one of these is probably the single most useful powdering tool that you can have next to a good sifter, which we'll discuss in a moment. I've owned quite a few of these over the years. In fact, I have 4 or 5 of them right now, and they're really very useful. A brand new one will cost $10 to $20, but if you check your local thrift store or garage sale, you can find one for even less than that. When using one of these little grinders, it's best to pulse rather than run it for an extended time. Pulsing reduces the heat buildup, although these grinders don't build up nearly as much heat as the larger tools will. And they're reasonably quiet too, which is a real plus when you compare them to the next tool, the blender. When you need to process a lot of material, or when you're dealing with really tough material, a blender is a great tool. Over the last 10 years, I've put a lot of hours on my blenders, and I've killed more than one. Don't make the mistake that I made when I purchased my first blender for incense making. I went out and I found a brand new, inexpensive blender at a discount store. It was cheaply made, but I managed to make it last quite a few years. But after that, I started looking for blenders at thrift stores and garage sales. Now, I've learned several things about selecting and using blenders, but one real key is knowing the type of blender to buy. Most blenders are of one of 2 types. The first, and usually the less expensive type, uses a strong motor in the base that is attached to a notched rubber disc. The canister sits on top, and a set of spinning blades sit down in the bottom of the canister. Now, those blades are also attached to a notched rubber disc. So these 2 discs fit together so that as the motor spins, it catches the rubber disc attached to the blades, and that forces them to spin as well. The problem with this style of blender is that if there's too much resistance to the blades, the 2 rubber discs will slip past each other because the top disc just can't spin fast enough to keep up with the motor. If that happens, those rubber discs will quickly heat up and be damaged. So if you use this type of blender and you hear the motor slow down unexpectedly, you should immediately shut it off and check to make sure the blades are spinning freely. A second type of blender doesn't use the rubber discs. This style of blender uses a metal shaft that is attached to the motor. That shaft fits inside the blade assembly that's down in the bottom of the canister. Now with this design, it's almost impossible for the blades to slip. You still need to listen for those unexpected slowdowns, but minor resistance isn't a problem like it is with the other type. If you purchase a new blender, you'll pay a good deal more for one of the shaft-style blenders. But again, you know me, check yard sales and thrift stores and you're going to find that both styles of those blenders are often sold for the same price. So always look for the shaft-driven style for incense making or milkshake making. It's worth mentioning that blenders may come with a glass canister or a plastic one. The glass containers are a lot easier to clean, they don't stain, and they're generally more durable. They won't become frosted after powdering hard materials. The hard materials can scratch the inside of the plastic containers, and over time it makes it difficult to see inside. One nice thing is that most blenders have interchangeable canisters and blades. That means that you can often use a canister from a rubber-footed blender on a shaft-driven base just by changing out that blade assembly. The canister and the base don't have to look pretty as long as they work well together. Sometimes mixing and matching bases and canisters in a thrift store can give you a powerful blender for $10 or less. When using a mortar and pestle, a knife, or even a coffee grinder, it's pretty easy to get good results. They aren't complicated to use. A blender is a little different. The goal with a blender is to keep a good flow of material from the bottom to the top of the canister and back. Now, depending on what you're powdering and how much material you have in the blender, you may find that the material at the bottom of the canister is being circulated and chopped and re-chopped, while the material at the top of the canister is untouched, it's just sitting there. Usually removing some of the material from the canister will allow for a better flow. Some materials, especially those that contain moisture, tend to clump and just won't flow. So continue reducing the amount of material to see if you can get a good flow started. But if you can't, then use a coffee grinder or mortar and pestle. Once you get a nice flow going, you'll sometimes see that the material is flowing from the bottom to the top, and other times the material is being pushed up and it flows the other way around. Either way is perfectly fine. Once you have a good flow moving in either direction, you can gradually add more material. Most blenders have tops with a removable cover so that you can safely drop material in. You just remove the little cover from the top of the big top. You just want to make sure that you don't add too much material at once, or you can stop that all-important flow of material, and you don't want that to happen. Because of their power and how quickly they heat up, I rarely, these days probably never, use resins in blenders. Resins can quickly heat, they can melt and then run down inside that blade assembly. It's very difficult to clean, and it can cause the motor to burn out in some cases. Now, there's one other category of grinder, and that's the true mill. They're hand-powered mills, but they're extremely difficult to use for grinding most incense ingredients. They heat up too much for resins, and they're very difficult to crank when working with wood powders or other tougher materials. But now there are also powered mills. These usually have a powerful electric motor, although there are some that actually use combustion engines. I can't show you one of these mills in action because I don't own one. If you ever want to endear yourself to me and have your own custom incense designed for you for free, send me an electric grain mill. These are how you can create fine powders from even the hardest wood. These things cost hundreds of dollars used, and most of them are really heavy, so they're expensive to ship. On top of that, they're loud. But if you start working on a large scale, take advantage of a powered mill if you can. I know I will if I ever can. Now, regardless of which tool you use to powder ingredients, there's one other critical tool to this process. No matter how good your grinder, without a good sifter, you'll never get the desired powder. A good sifter will ensure that your powder is fine and the particles are consistently sized, and all of that contributes to even burning. Many incense makers will not only sift the individual ingredients as they're powdered, they'll also sift their finished incense blend before adding water to ensure that all the particles are similarly sized. Now, I own a variety of sifters, but I typically use the finest ones that I have. I've used both metal and plastic sifters and don't really notice any difference between them. The critical aspect is always how fine the screen mesh is. I really like this metal hoop sifter. It has relatively high sides and it's got a really fine screen. It wasn't expensive and it's a great size for most of my needs. I also own a much larger version of the same sifter. This one's great when I'm working with large amounts of material. Sometimes when I'm powdering big amounts of material, I actually have two blenders running at the same time. So having a large sifter like this allows me to sift piles of material quickly and then return the larger particles back to the blender for further processing. And unless you plan to powder pounds of the same ingredient, a small sifter is a more logical choice. A 4-inch sifter seems to be a good all-purpose size. Now, when you sift ingredients, some of the material will stay in the air, little clouds. That's not only unhealthy for you to breathe, it's also wasting some of the best powder that you've worked so hard to make. The superfine particles that go into the air are really desirable for incense making. You'll find similar fine particles tend to stick to the inside of the lid of your blender, so don't overlook those when it's time to sift. The best way I've found to prevent these clouds of floating incense ingredients and to capture that material so that you can use it for incense making is a simple trick with a plastic bag. Using a 1-gallon locking style plastic bag, you can insert your sifter and close the bag so that it completely encloses the bottom of the sifter. As you shake your sifter, those tiniest particles that would normally have been lost as a dust cloud are caught inside the bag. This reduces waste, and it's a frugal way to handle precious incense ingredients. Now, if you're working on a larger scale, you can use the same approach with a larger plastic bag, but if that's not an option, then I like to sift onto a large sheet of paper. That makes it easy to move the powder around and transfer it to different containers. But in that situation, with the clouds of material, I wear a face mask so that I'm not breathing in that dust. You should do the same. And once you've powdered something, it's more susceptible to losing its essential oils through evaporation. Any powder that you don't use immediately should be stored in an airtight container and kept away from light, especially sunlight. There are a lot of tools you can use to make powdering ingredients easier, but one or two inexpensive items are all you need to get started on the incense making path. As long as you make good powdering techniques part of your normal incense making process, you can count on incense that will burn evenly and predictably. Well, that's all for today's episode of Incense Magic. If you've enjoyed this video, I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. I also encourage you to visit my websites where you'll find a link to my online incense group, the Incense Exchange, where you can connect with incense makers from all around the world. Now, on the next episode of Incense Magic, we'll be talking about extruders. They're tools that are easy to make and can really transform the process for making all types of incense sticks. I hope you'll join me for that. Until next time, bright blessings.